Hello, and thank you for coming. Hello from 90% humidity, Minneapolis. For days here in Ashburn, it's been over 90% humidity. I mean, like 92%, 94%. There was one day that was 97%. It's a little nicer today. Hi, Kay. I was watching Status Quo too. I thought, again, Jordan was doing a great job talking to some people who were very well informed about things and who had the right take about things. Please share this as much as you can. I know attendance is likely to be small tonight because people are probably watching the Democrats for hints about what the people who are who may be going to run this country if they win are thinking about right now. I myself I'm not really that interested in what they're thinking about because I think their thinking is going to be changed by what's going to happen over the next few months. And I don't mean just because I still think these people are going to win and win big, but also I think because they're going to find when they win big, they are faced with one hell of a big mess, both in actually removing Trump and also in doing concrete things as quickly as they can to fix the mess that we're having. So, anyway, I think things are going to be difficult. But let's start off our treatments tonight with an interview of Stephanie Kelton that appeared in Dissent magazine. And I'm going to go through that and discuss it with you. So let me share my screen here, and we will access that when I can find it. Here it is. There we go. You should be seeing it now along with me. Yeah, monetary myth busting, an interview with Stephanie Kelton is what it's called. And the interviewer and the author of the article is Mark Levinson. This was on August 11th, 2020. And Mark Levinson starts off, he says, Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth, Modern Money Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy, is a foundational book on economic policy. If we don't get the issue of the deficit right, we get almost nothing right. This book couldn't be timelier. Almost 50 million people have applied for unemployment insurance since the COVID-19 pandemic started. There's been a $3 trillion government response, much of which is expiring, and much of which was wasted because it went to the wrong people for the wrong things. That's a little bit, that wasn't a part of the article. That was a little addition that I had. The virus is still spreading in the United States, which will lead to more shutdowns and more unemployment. And just a note on that, last night As I think you already know, we passed 175,000 fatalities here in the United States. Mainstream news is still reporting things at about 170,000. They're always behind, but we are now, as of this moment, I believe, that we've had another 1,253 cases today, and we are now at 176,327 fatalities in the United States, and deaths per million has gone up now to 532. And when we look at the ranking of nations by deaths per million, we see the United States is in the same place. Ignoring the two very small countries, it's in 8th place at 532 deaths per million. We're now only 21 deaths behind Chile, but deaths per million behind Chile, which is at 553 deaths per million. And you'll notice Sweden has gone up by 1 death per million. So we've been rapidly catching up to Sweden. We're now only 42 deaths per million behind Sweden. At the rate we've been going, we'll probably pass them in about a week from now, if we keep up the same rates, which will be quite a milestone, I think. Not a milestone of a happy kind, of course. And Italy won't be too far behind that. And then we'll be closing in on the UK and Spain. Aye. What a travesty. Okay, back to sharing Stephanie Kelton. Still up there, that's good. Okay, so the virus is still spreading in the United States, which will lead to more shutdowns and more unemployment. We're on the verge of catastrophic state and local government cutbacks, and we've talked about that a lot. We've covered that a lot. Okay, in the past, we still have almost 4 million jobs that could be shut down due to state and local government cutbacks that we know are coming up. We've already had 1 million jobs that have gone away for the time being due to state and local government cutbacks. And we're heading into an election where polls indicate much of the American public believes that we have to address an unsustainable national debt and budget deficit. And the question for Stephanie is, what does your book have to say to the current moment? Steph says, you captured the backdrop before the coronavirus pandemic. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, was forecasting deficits in excess of $1 trillion a year for the foreseeable future. To a lot of people, that seemed alarming. Now look where we are. Since March, Congress has committed roughly $3 trillion to deal with the economic fallout related to the pandemic. All of it will add to the deficit, and they're getting ready to add even more. This is happening on the heels of a Democratic presidential primary, where we spent the better part of a year listening to candidates put forward their agendas, and at every turn getting dogged by the question, quote, how are you going to pay for it? Where is the money going to come from, unquote. Every presidential candidate from Bernie Sanders to Amy Klobuchar bent over backwards to show how they would, quote, pay for, unquote, their proposals without adding to the deficit. We spent a year arguing about where the money would come from, and then suddenly the world opened to a new reality. The coronavirus came, and Congress started spinning out multi-trillion-dollar spending bills without any of these so-called pay-fors, quote, unquote. By the way, Of course, no pay-fors were mentioned, but some people, conservative people, both on the Republican and Democratic Party, are planning on austerity right now. They're planning on foreclosing, if they can, on the pay-fors, but later on. But anyway, Stephanie says, we had to act. That meant adding to the deficit to fight the pandemic. That's a perfect entry point for a book like this that speaks to the fears and anxieties that we have about deficit spending and adding to the national debt, both of which we are doing on an almost unprecedented scale right now. Yes, we're adding to the deficit spending, and adding to the national debt, but I don't know whether we're really adding to those as fast as we're adding to the deaths per million count. That's just a side comment. Levinson says, in your book, you debunk a number of myths that are associated with the deficit. One widely held belief is that since households have to balance their budgets, so should the government. In 2010, the Democrats controlled the presidency, and Congress and unemployment was almost 10%. President Obama went on national television and said that, like most American families, the federal government had to tighten its belt. It was a defining moment, and the premature austerity led to an excruciating, slow economic recovery that probably contributed to Trump's victory in 2016. Probably is the understatement of the year. Why were people so dissatisfied in 2016? Because many of them hadn't recovered due to the slowness of the economic recovery. They hadn't recovered. They had lost ground through the whole Obama presidency. And in 2016, they wanted to hear about how they were going to gain ground, how things were going to get better for them. And the brilliant Hillary Clinton could only reply, you will never have Medicare for all. And you are going to have to adapt yourself to more budget balancing, more austerity, more slowness of recovery, more fiscal responsibility, as she continued to agree with the Peterson Foundation about basic fiscal policy. Anyway, Stephanie ends that, I'm sorry, so Levinson ends that by saying, talk about the myth of the government as a household. Kelton says, I had the same reaction and I remember the speech. It was the State of the Union address. Even before that speech in 2009, just shortly after taking office, when we were staring down the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, Obama was asked in an interview, quote, at what point do we run out of money, unquote? And he said, quote, well, we're out of money now. That was like a punch in the gut for me, says Steph, because I sensed that what we were facing was not a garden variety economic recession, that this was going to be orders of magnitude more severe, and that what Congress needed to do was step in to provide the fiscal support that was going to be necessary to prevent a very protracted and deep downturn. To hear him use those words was definitely not a good sign. You ask why we analogize the federal government's finances with personal finances. And she adds, I think politicians want to be able to communicate with people effectively. They think the best way to communicate about complex issues like the federal government's finances is to talk in ways that resonate with us. So the framing becomes mom and dad at the kitchen table, working to balance the budget. Just like you, the federal government needs to start getting its spending in line with its income. You know you can't spend more than you take in year after year. It's risky to pile on debt. You can go broke. And so Mark Levinson asks, why is that a myth? Stephanie says, the simplest way to say it is that government issues the currency and households and businesses don't. If you have the sole legal authority to issue the US dollar, it can only come from you. Would you ever worry about running out? Would you ever worry about bills coming due that you couldn't afford to pay? Would you worry about being forced into bankruptcy? No, you wouldn't. You're the issuer of the currency. It's the rest of us who have to worry. It couldn't be clearer in this moment what makes us different from the federal government. The federal government is the one propping up the airlines and other industries, sending out $1,200 checks to most Americans, topping up unemployment insurance with an extra $600 per week, if you were fortunate enough to get the system to recognize you were unemployed, helping small businesses cover some expenses and keep their workers on payroll, and so on. If all of us had the currency issuer power of the federal government, then small businesses would look after themselves. The airlines would look after themselves. That's obviously not how it works. State and local governments are begging the federal government for assistance. Governors and mayors across the country have been saying to Congress, "We need your help," quote unquote. The reason is that state and local governments, like households and private businesses, can't issue the currency. We're all trapped in the same position vis-a-vis the currency. We are all users of the dollar. The federal government is in an elevated position. It's the issuer of the currency. It can do what the rest of us can't do. It's true. And if I may add, at this point, there are others who can create dollars, specifically banks, can create dollars out of thin air. But those dollars are not net financial assets. They are accompanied by debt obligations. When the federal government, however, the deficit spends, it creates not only new currency, but it creates net financial assets as well. That's important for us to note and remember. So Levinson says, why isn't the fact that the U.S. government is going to accrue trillions of dollars of debt a burden on future generations? Stephanie says, the deficit hawks try to convince us that at some point it has to be paid back and that the bill is going to fall on the rest of us. That's not the case at all. Calling this thing the national debt is a big problem. What's really happening is that the government is basically making some of its payments with interest-bearing dollars. We call those dollars U.S. treasuries. Unfortunately, we call the entire stockpile of these financial instruments, the national debt. Now, that's not quite right, what Stephanie's saying there. What's really happening is the government is basically making some of its payments. It's making all of its payments with new money created by the Fed. The interest-bearing dollars are the treasuries that the U.S. Treasury Department unnecessarily issues because it believes that the dollars paid for those treasuries by private sector parties who buy the treasuries, who buy the debt instruments, but those dollars are what is paying for treasury spending. Only it's not those dollars. Those dollars are destroyed in the process of Fed settlement of the transactions. The Fed always creates entirely new dollar reserves for the Treasury to spend. Going on. Unfortunately, we call the entire stockpile of these financial instruments the national debt. And the word, quote, debt, unquote, creates all sorts of unnecessary anxiety in people. It reminds people of their credit card debt. their car payment, their student loan debt, their mortgage, and they say, quote, well, debt can be dangerous. I don't want to be in debt. I don't want too much debt. My country is in debt, so that's bad, unquote. And Mark Levinson, rather than pursuing that, which I think I would have a little further, says, are there limits to the deficit? Can the government just spend in an unrestrained manner? And Stephanie says, there are limits. If I had to describe the modern monetary theory project in a single sentence, I would say it is about replacing an artificial revenue constraint with a real inflation constraint. So there are limits, but the limit is not a predetermined numerical level or a percentage of the budget. There is no strict financial constraint. A currency issuing government can afford to buy whatever is priced and available for sale in its own currency. The limit is the impact of the spending, not the spending itself, and not the deficit. The limit is inflation. That is central to MMT. And she goes on, I would go further and say that no school of macroeconomic thought treats inflation more seriously than MMT. We place it at the center of the analytic framework. Inflation is the binding constraint. We also face ecological constraints. Just because we can extract fossil fuels and other forms of carbon-emitting, polluting sources of energy doesn't mean we should do that. No one who has studied MMT can claim that MMT advocates unlimited spending. MMT is about identifying the real limits and not cowering in fear of running out of money or adding to the deficit. Levinson asks, in your book, you claim that a misplaced emphasis on the fiscal deficit covers up other deficits that we should really be concerned about. Number, what do you mean by that? Stephanie says, today there is a yearning to return to normal. But what did normal before the pandemic look like? Several $1 trillion of needed repairs in our crumbling infrastructure. Normal was 87 million Americans who either didn't have health insurance or were underinsured. Normal was 500,000 medical-related bankruptcies every year in this country. Normal was 40 million people living in poverty. Normal was millions of people who aren't prepared for retirement, who can't afford to send their kids to school or can't pay back their student loan debt. Normal was 40% of families not having $400 set aside to handle an unexpected financial emergency. Normal was a great city like Flint, Michigan, not having safe water. These are the deficits that matter. Those are the kinds of shortfalls that I wish we were all worried about. Now, that would have been a rant fully worthy of Bernie Sanders or AOC. It's unfortunate that Bernie has not used that particular paragraph from Stephanie yet. I highly recommend it to him. Okay, Levinson says, explain MMT and why you became a supporter. Stephanie says, when I first started writing about and researching government finance, public money, and the deficit, there was nothing called MMT. That label emerged later. I was in graduate school studying economics in the mid-1990s at Cambridge University when I won a fellowship to the Levy Economics Institute. An economist named Randall Wray was there, and he was someone I had studied under briefly before starting my program at Cambridge. He was working on a book called Understanding Modern Money, and that's when I really started to dig into a lot of this stuff. I found the ideas both jarring and fascinating. It was very different from what I had learned as an undergrad studying economics and what I had learned as a graduate student at Cambridge, reading early drafts of Ray's work and also the writings of the writings of Warren Mosler led me to begin my own research into the mechanics, of monetary operations. I wanted to get down in the weeds and understand exactly how the Treasury and the Fed coordinate their payments. I started reading and researching and talking to people at the Treasury and Fed. And later, after maybe 6 months or so, I came to understand how government finance really works. At that point, I realized that some of the more jarring parts of MMT, like the claim that the federal government doesn't spend taxpayer money, quote unquote, were sound. I worked through the mechanics, and I could see that Ray and Mosler had the sequencing right. The government spends first, and then taxes or borrows. Taxes weren't paying for anything. That was totally new to me. I had been trained to believe that the government needs our money, that the purpose of taxing and borrowing was to help the government raise revenue to pay its bills. That's how I was trained to think about these things. That once I persuaded myself that the sequencing that I had been taught was wrong, and that the government or one of its agents has to spend or lend the dollars into existence before anybody can use them to pay taxes or buy government bonds, then it just flipped my worldview around. I started seeing the federal government as the issuer of the currency, and everything follows from that. And Levinson then asks, within the progressive economic community, there is a debate. There is a debate between left, also progressive and Keynesians, and some adherents of MMT. Okay, and many progressive economists argue that they arrive at the same policy conclusions as you, but they don't need MMT to get there. Stephanie says, it's one thing to be right. It's another thing to be right for the right reasons, because if you're right for the right reasons, there's a higher probability that you will continue to get things right. Actually, if you're right for the absolutely right reasons, then you will continue to get things right because you're operating with the correct analytical framework, as Stephanie says. You can be right accidentally with a traditional neoclassical economic framework. You can also use conventional macro to demonstrate what should be intuitively obvious, like showing that austerity in the midst of a depression is bad policy, as people like Paul Krugman did during the Great Recession. Of course, MMT economists were also pressing lawmakers to embrace larger deficits. That wasn't exactly a difficult call. But what about getting the harder things right? For example, the euro. MMT economists were in a distinct, were in a minority, a distinct minority, warning years before the euro was officially launched that giving up sovereign currencies in favor of a common currency would create default risk and raise the potential for a debt crisis. Exactly what happened in countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece. Krugman's model didn't help him see that coming because it didn't account for the importance of currency regimes in analyzing the limits on government borrowing. Or what about the budget surpluses during the Clinton years, or the Bush tax cuts, or the Trump tax cuts? Well, MMTers warned that the Clinton surpluses were unsustainable, that the tax cuts posed no risk to the government's finances. Krugman was talking about deficits driving up interest rates and warning that the United States could end up like Greece. He wrote about being puzzled by the fact that Japan could borrow at extremely low interest rates, despite having the world's largest public debt, while the Italian government faced rates that were 5 times as high, even though their debt to GDP ratio was substantially lower. MMTers were never puzzled by the divergence in borrowing costs. To us, the answer was obvious. One country was borrowing its own sovereign currency, and the other, Italy, had abandoned its sovereign currency and was now obligated to repay bondholders in a currency, specifically the euro, that it could no longer issue. That's at the core of MMT. It's about it's about having monetary sovereignty. If you understand the difference, then you understand that countries with a high degree of monetary sovereignty don't have to be fearful of deficits, raising borrowing costs, and pushing a country into bankruptcy. Krugman missed all of this stuff. I believe that after that he met after he met Warren Mosler. I have a very nice photo of him holding Mosler's book. Krugman's views began to shift. A couple of years after writing about the puzzling difference between Japan and Italy, he wrote a piece explaining that currency regimes appeared to explain the difference. He was adopting more MMT. In his writings, you could see him inching closer and closer to where we had been a decade earlier. I'll give you one more example of a big policy conclusion that I think MMT economists got right and more mainstream Keynesian economists got wrong. In November of 2017, Larry Summers was all over the media warning if the Republicans succeeded passing the Trump tax cuts, the United States would end up, quote, living on a shoestring for decades to come. He warned that Congress would be unable to use fiscal policy in the event of a military crisis or to respond to the next recession. But look where we are. The coronavirus came, and Congress immediately started using fiscal policy to support the economy, adding trillions of dollars to the deficit. This idea that the deficits of the past somehow constrain the ability of Congress to commit to more spending in the present or future was just wrong. Stephanie, of course, absolutely right about that. Doesn't matter how high your debts are in the past, as long as you're a monetary sovereign, you always have the same ability to commit to more spending. The same ability. Your debt to GDP ratio and the level of your debts has absolutely nothing to do with your fiscal sustainability. The only thing that has to do with your fiscal sustainability is whether or not you maintain your monetary sovereignty. That's a lesson that MMT teaches us. Okay. So Levinson asks, but it's not just economists like Krugman and Summers. Many more heterodox economists agree with your policy conclusions, but don't adopt MMT. Stephanie says, I have spent literally 0 hours of my professional career critiquing the work of other heterodox economists. None. That's not my interest. I'm out to challenge the mainstream, not my heterodox friends, whether they're Marxists or institutionalists or post-Keynesians. It is true that we often reach similar policy conclusions, but we get there using different analytical frameworks. Sometimes I think they arrive at the right conclusion for the wrong reasons, but I don't go around criticizing them for not adopting our framework. And so Levinson says, the mainstream of the economics profession seems to have moved a lot on the issue of the deficit. Last year, the president of the American Economic Association, Olivier Olivier Blanchard, gave a speech in which he argued that concerns about public debt have been exaggerated. Summers and Jason Furman wrote an important anti-austerity piece in Foreign Affairs. But Jason Furman was a former White House economist also. Yet one of the premier Keynesian economists of our time, Robert Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky, recently wrote in an essay with Mariana Mazzucato that there is little evidence that any new fiscal thinking is underway, quote unquote. And so Levinson asked, how would you characterize the current the moment, current moment. Stephanie says, that line about the lack of new fiscal thinking grabbed me as well. I think there's a lot of evidence. You cite some of it. Skidelsky, for example, has recently become an outspoken advocate for job guarantee. And Matsukato has been doing great work on climate change and the importance of public investment as a catalyst for innovation. She has a new book coming out where I think it's fair to say she treats my arguments in a very sympathetic way. In that same essay, they wrote, quote, the state must be given a permanent, continuing role in guiding, stabilizing, and if need be, transforming economic life, intervening only in bad times to fix the system, guarantees another crisis, unquote. That is exactly the kind of new thinking we need. So Levinson then says, you were part of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force. They just issued their report. How much of your analysis is embodied in those in the recommendations? Stephanie says, some. You will see in there a couple of paragraphs about reforming the federal budgeting process. This is crucial. If we're going to do something big on climate or infrastructure, the way the budget process currently works is that you send the bill over to CBO and ask them to score it. CBO then tells lawmakers whether and by how much it will add to the deficit and increase the national debt over time. This process is designed to elicit the least useful feedback you could possibly ask for. I think we all understand that the incoming administration is going to be facing numerous crises that we're going to require the presence of large fiscal deficits for an indeterminate period of time. We cannot afford to return to the, quote, pay for, unquote, game where lawmakers refuse to do anything that adds to the deficit. Are you listening, Nancy Pelosi? Going on with Stephanie. And so how do you accomplish that? How do you make sure the incoming administration isn't hamstrung by, quote, pay as you go, unquote, budgeting rules or CBO or whatever? Because it will be much harder to pass legislation if Democrats are only willing to do things that will satisfy the scorekeepers over at CBO. The task force, the recommendations include some language about how to begin to think about alternative metrics by which to evaluate the proposed spending. Levinson asks, is the job guarantee in there? Stephanie says, no, not a guarantee. But there is some language in there about direct job creation of the kind that was undertaken by FDR in the New Deal. That leans a little bit into the MMT proposal for public service employment. I think we're ultimately going to need something as bold as what MMT advocates, but you could fill jars with the sweat that went into getting the language we got into the recommendations document. So Levinson says, in the Financial Times, Martin Wolf said this about your book, quote, in my view, it is right and wrong. It is right because there is no simple budget constraint. It is wrong because it will prove impossible to manage an economy sensibly once politicians believe there is no budget constraint, unquote. So Stephanie replied very politely. Stephanie is always polite. She says, I thought that was an extraordinary statement. I think it's an extraordinarily cynical and arrogant statement. But anyway, let's be satisfied with extraordinary. Stephanie goes on. I believe in democracy. MMT is not granting any new powers or authorities to Congress. Congress knows that it has the power of the purse. The idea that MMT is letting the cat out of the bag and somehow opening us up to new vulnerabilities, I just don't understand. What I think the book does is attempt to clear away the myths and misunderstandings about deficits and debt. If someone confronts their representatives and says, quote, why aren't you doing more to get clean water to this district or to get infrastructure repaired, unquote. And the representative responds, quote, I'd love to be able to help on that, but we've got this big deficit and we have this enormous debt that needs to be paid off, unquote. Steph says, I want people who read the book to understand that this is an evasion. I want people to understand that the deficit and the national debt are not obstacles to progress, and that our government can always afford to fund its priorities. And she might have added, our priorities as well. Going on. The aim of the book is to empower citizens with a truer understanding of what's possible and what the limits are. Let's be honest with the people and then hold the politicians accountable at the ballot box. No one could have said it any better than that, okay, in my opinion. We need an end to the cynicism on the part of economists such as Martin Wolf or Paul Samuelson or other neoclassical economists. They have no right to manipulate the people. They need to tell the truth. Stephanie's book is right because there is no simple budget constraint. And it is also right because it is honest about that. Whether it proves impossible to manage an economy sensibly, once politicians believe there is no budget constraint, that is still something to be tested. Wolf has a right to his opinion, but it's not his opinion qua professional economist. It's his opinion as an anti-democrat who does not believe in democracy. Also, Stephanie did not say there is no budget constraint. She said there is no budget constraint in relation to deficits, in relation to debt. There is a budget constraint when you look at the likely outcomes of what your budget is. If your deficit is so high that it's going to create demand pull inflation, well, that should be a constraining factor on your budget if you believe that. But that is a real world constraint as far as you know the real world. It is not an artificial constraint. It is not a constraint based on some arbitrary number that you've decided the budget cannot go beyond. It is a constraint based on analysis of likely consequences. And so there we are. I think that was a very good interview. Stephanie stated here the basics of MMT and some of the arguments against it in very simple fashion. This is a New York Times quality interview. It is no more sophisticated than you have to be to read the New York Times, okay, or the LA Times or the Boston Globe, or Bloomberg News. It's okay for any of that type, of publication. Anyone who can understand that type of publication can understand what Stephanie said here. It's an excellent piece, of work, and I was happy to go through it with you. Okay, so what is next on the agenda? Just a brief excursion into some recent news, and why can't I get rid of the garbage on my screen? I don't know. But anyway, this is from the Fiscal Times. Here it is. The X. This is from the Fiscal Times, and it's, I'll share it with you. After I get through this, which I'll do in just a few minutes, I'll go on to fascism, which is the second of our major subjects in this in-depth show. So Trump's payroll tax plan and unemployment boost run into resistance. So you remember I was talking about this last week at some length, and I said I didn't think these things by Trump were going to work. I was not the only one who said so, but Dave Dayen also said so. Anyway, Yuval Rosenberg wrote this article on August 18th, 2020, and it's entitled Trump's Payroll Tax Plan and Unemployment Boost Run into Resistance. From the moment Trump unveiled his actions that he claimed would provide economic relief to those hurt by the coronavirus pandemic, there were questions about just how effective those moves would be. 10 days later, two of the key steps Trump announced are running into some stiff resistance. Business groups warned about Trump's payroll tax plan. Oh, also, by the way, this particular rag, the Fiscal Times, was started by the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. It got started with capital, from that foundation. And normally this reflects the Peterson view, when it comes to editorials and things like that. But to go on, business groups warn about Trump's payroll tax plan. More than 30 industry associations and business groups, including the Chamber of Commerce, the National Retail Federation, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the National Restaurant Association, warned Tuesday that many employers won't take part in Trump's plan to defer employee payroll taxes through the end of the year. What did I tell you? In a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, the group said that Trump's suspension of the payroll tax could leave workers facing large tax bills once the deferral ends in 2021. For example, a worker earning $35,000 would see an $83.46 boost per pay period, they wrote, but could then owe $751 in deferred taxes. In January, of course, someone earning $75,000 would get $178.85 boost in every paycheck, but could face a $1,609 tax hit in 2021. Trump has said he will push to have those taxes permanently forgiven, but that would require an act of Congress. Lawmakers in both parties have expressed concerns about a payroll tax cut, and it's not clear how likely lawmakers might be to ultimately forgive any deferred taxes. Especially true if Trump should lose, right? Quote, many of our members consider it unfair to employees to make a decision that would force a big tax bill on them next year, unquote, the business groups wrote. Quote again, it would also be unworkable to implement a system where employees make this decision. Therefore, many of our members would likely decline to implement deferral, choosing instead to continue to withhold and remit to the government the payroll taxes required by law, unquote. So is the Secretary of the Treasury going to decline to receive any payroll tax deposits from business? I don't think so. States hesitant on Trump's unemployment payments. Trump said his plan would provide $400 a week in supplemental benefits covering lost wages, but $100 of that was required to come from the states. That was because he was putting this through FEMA, and FEMA required 25% cost sharing, a structure that drew complaints about the costs being imposed and the complexity of setting up a new payment system. In the end, the Trump administration said the federal government would pay a fixed $300, and states could choose whether to add another $100 or not. Still, the Trump plan has found little traction, the Associated Press reports, based on a survey of states. As of Monday, 18 states have said they will take the federal grants, allowing them to increase unemployment checks by $300 or $400 a week. The AP tally shows that 30 states have said they're still evaluating the offer or have not said whether they plan to accept the president's slimmed down benefits. Two have said no. The AP reports that most states have signed on to the program have chosen the $300 option, but even once they've agreed to take part, states will face implementation issues. There's another issue they may face. Okay, the payment of $300 a week to these states by the federal government through the FEMA program without cost sharing would be illegal. Illegal. It would be subject to lawsuits by people who know that it's illegal. The Trump administration could be sued. The states accepting the $300 a week could be sued because the legislative authority is not there. Anyway, quote, New Mexico was the first state to apply for the aid last week and one of the first to be announced as a recipient by FEMA. But Bill McCanley, Secretary of the state's Department of Workforce Solutions, said it's not clear when the money will start going out, largely because the state needs to pre-program benefit distribution systems to make it work. When the state says it needs to pre-program, that means it needs to rewrite the computer software to make the benefit distribution system actually work. They have to re-computer program it, folks. Not just change their program. They have to reprogram the software. Get their computer nicks to proof this and to do this in just a few weeks. Fat chance. Okay, onwards to fascism. And let's share the screen for that. Let's share it. I see we have 16 people here doing pretty well, considering that we're probably competing with Barack Obama right now. Oh, well. Here it is. There we go. I thought this was immensely interesting. This is by Bill Blum, who's more or less a political theorist. How Donald Trump has constructed a legal infrastructure of fascism. That was a Freudian slip on my part. And the debate over whether Donald Trump is a fascist is no longer confined to a narrow segment of the far left. It is now out in the open. Even mainstream columnists, like the New York Times' Michelle Goldberg and the Washington Post's Ishant Tharoor, and influential Democratic politicians such as Oregon Senator Ron Wyden have come to use the, quote, F, unquote, word to describe our 45th commander-in-chief. Although it is an emotionally loaded and often misused term, fascism as it's real today is a political and cultural force, a set of core beliefs, and a mode of governance, as it was when Benito Mussolini founded the Italian Fascist Party in 1919 and declared himself dictator 6 years later. It's wise to note, by the way, that he didn't actually declare himself dictator until 6 years after he founded the party. Trump hasn't even founded an officially fascist party yet. Nor is fascism a foreign phenomenon restricted to South American banana republics or failed European states. As University of London professor Sarah Churchwell explained in a June 22nd essay published in the New York Review of Books, fascism has deep roots in the United States, spanning the decades from the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1920s to the rise of the German-American Bund in the 1930s, the ascendance of Depression-era demagogues like Huey Long, and the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Churchill's article is aptly titled, quote, American Fascism, It Has Happened Here, unquote. In it, she offers a working definition of fascism, noting that fascist movements, both past and present, in America and abroad, are united by conspicuous features that are recognizably shared. These include nostalgia for a pure, mythic, often rural past, cults of tradition and cultural regeneration, paramilitary groups, the delegitimizing of political opponents, and the demonization of critics, the universalizing of some groups as authentically national, while dehumanizing all other groups, hostility to intellectualism, attacks on a free press, anti-modernism, fetishized patriarchal masculinity, and a distressed sense of victimhood and collective grievance. Uh, Fascist mythologies often incorporate a notion of cleansing and exclusionary defense against racial or cultural contamination and related eugenicist preferences for certain bloodlines, quote unquote, over others, unquote. Anyone who has studied Trump's campaign rhetoric or watched the brutality of federal law enforcement officers deployed against protesters in Washington, D.C. and Portland, Oregon, can plainly see the features at work. But what about the legal structures that have permitted Trumpian fascism to take hold in a nation noted for its resilient democratic institutions and traditions? Like other fascists before him, Trump's path to power was made possible not by outright violations of the law, but by fundamental flaws in existing law embedded in Trump's case in the U.S. Constitution and key federal statutes that were in place long before he descended the escalator at Trump Tower to announce his initial presidential bid. These are the loopholes and voids in American democracy that were waiting for a would-be strong man like Trump to exploit. Although there are many such loopholes, Trump has benefited from 9 in particular. Before we go into the 9, let's point out that these were loopholes and voids in our democracy that have been known in most cases for a very long time, but which the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party in particular, as the party supposedly devoted to democracy, never bothered to fix. With all of the heavy majorities that Franklin Roosevelt had, he never tried to fix the electoral college system, did he? And as we go through the 9 in particular, we will see that lots of these were never addressed by succeeding Democratic or Republican presidents who had majorities large enough in Congress and at the state level to address some of these things. 1, the Electoral College. To go on with the article. The founding fathers who drafted the Constitution were visionaries and revolutionaries, but they were also wealthy white men of property, elitists, and in many instances slaveholders who deeply feared the potential, quote, tyranny, unquote, of the rule by the majority. Yes, slaveholders, of course, deeply feared a potential revolution by their black slaves. They were terribly, terribly afraid of that, panicked. Whenever even a small possibility appeared, they went frickin' nuts. Instead of designing a system of direct democracy that would allow the people to choose their president by a national popular vote, the founders established the Electoral College, which allocates to each state a number of electors equal to its combined congressional delegation. The District of Columbia was accorded 3 elector votes by the 23rd Amendment. It was ratified in 1961. When Americans go to the polls, they don't actually elect the president. They vote instead On a state-by-state basis, they vote instead for a slate of state electors who cast the real votes for the presidency. Yes. Alexander Hamilton argued in the Federalist Paper number 68 that entrusting the selection of president to electors rather than the people would ensure that presidents were chosen by, quote, men most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to such complicated investigations, unquote, and guarantee that, quote, the office of president will never fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications, unquote. And of course, it's we who are writing this Constitution who have the requisite qualifications. So it's people like us who should be able to vote. History has proven Hamilton and the founders wrong. On no fewer than 5 occasions, we have installed presidents who won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. John Quincy Adams in 1824. Who did he lose the popular vote to? Andrew Jackson. He lost it to Andrew Jackson, who swept him aside in 1828, of course. And Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876. Okay. Who lost in the popular vote, but in a very complicated after-election affair, managed to accede to the presidency, nevertheless, over Samuel J. Tilden, who I believe was the governor of New York at that time. Benjamin Harrison, okay, in 1888, became the president in spite of the fact that I believe Grover Cleveland got a majority of the popular vote in that election. George W. Bush in 2000, of course we know all about 2000, how the Supreme Court seized on power in order to put George W. Bush into the presidency. I believe that the Constitution called for it to go to the Congress instead of to go to the Supreme Court, but well, Gore chose to accept it. He chose not to call people out into the streets. He accepted the Supreme Court's choice. And then Donald Trump, of course, in 2016. Trump lost the 2016 popular vote by a greater margin, roughly 2.8 million votes, than any president in U.S. history. His fascism represents a tyranny of the minority, unanticipated by the founders, but made possible by the system they devised. I don't know. It seems to me the founders intended a system where there would be a tyranny of the minority. That is, of those who had the requisite qualifications to deal with the complexity, right? I mean, they don't fit the whole pattern of fascism. But clearly, the founders were interested in minority rule. That's what they built in. Anyway, 2, the constitutional design of the Senate. Under the Constitution, all states are allocated 2 senators, regardless of population. 2016, Senate Democrats won far more votes nationally than their Republican counterparts. Nonetheless, the GOP emerged with a solid majority in the upper chamber. Since his inauguration, Trump has used the Republican-controlled Senate to further minority rule, ramming through 2 conservative appointments to the Supreme Court and many more appointments to the lower federal bench. Trump also benefited from the GOP's hold on the Senate in his impeachment trial, securing a quick and easy acquittal, seeking to protect the president at all times. Senate Republicans blocked any witnesses from being called. Wonderful. Third is abuse of executive orders. Although the Constitution vests Congress with the power to pass laws, President can issue executive orders pursuant to grants of congressional authority or under their inherent powers. Every American president has issued at least one, dating back to George Washington's 1794 proclamation aimed at suppressing the Whiskey Rebellion. Unless overturned by the courts, executive orders have the force of law. However, they only last for the period of the executive's rule. As soon as the next executive takes office, he can revoke any executive order from the previous executive. Ultimately, it's not the quantity of executive orders that matters, but the quality. If executive orders run afoul of Congress, lawmaking powers, to a great enough degree, they're conduit to autocracy. Among Trump's most odious mandates are his Muslim travel ban of 2017, his 2018 order establishing a task force to evaluate the operations and finances of the beleaguered Postal Service, his 2019 order imposing additional sanctions on Iran in the aftermath of his decision to withdraw from the nuclear agreement, and the order issued this past May purportedly for preventing online censorship. Critics charge the censorship order had nothing to do with free speech, but was motivated by Trump's desire to exact revenge against Twitter for removing some of his more unhinged, conspiracy-driven posts. On August 8th, he announced additional orders designed to break the congressional stalemate over a new stimulus package to combat the economic devastation wrought by COVID-19. The new edicts may look benign at first glance, but they include a directive slashing the $600 per week in enhanced unemployment benefits approved by Congress in March to $400, with cash-strapped states being held responsible for doling out 1/4 of the amount. Another order calls for deferring the Social Security payroll tax, a step that could severely undermine the delicate balance sheet of the Social Security Administration in the middle of a pandemic. That I do not see. I don't think it could severely undermine the balance sheet, of the SSA, for reasons I've outlined in previous live streams. 4, the National Emergencies Act, passed in 1976 as a post-Watergate reform to rein in presidential power. The National Emergencies Act has in practice been a failure, in large part because it doesn't define what constitutes a national emergency. The act accords the president complete discretion to issue an emergency declaration as long as the president specifies at least one emergency power contained in an existing federal statute that would be used to address a declared emergency. In February 2019, Trump invoked the NEA to redirect $2.5 billion in federal funds for construction of his shameful wall along the border with Mexico, citing an obscure section of the United States Code dealing with deployment of the Army's the Ready Reserve units. In July 2019, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 ruling decided along ideological lines, overturned the lower court decision that had blocked the funding transfer. In October 2019, Trump vetoed a bipartisan bill that Congress had passed to repeal the emergency decree. What emergency will Trump declare next? How about a crackdown on the fake news media? A 1934 law still on the books allows the president to shut down or take control of, quote, any facility or station for wire communication, unquote. Arguably, the internet, in the digital era, upon his proclamation that, quote, there exists a state of or threat of war or other national emergency, unquote. 4, that's horrifying, that one, isn't it? 5, the scapegoating of immigrants. The most heartless and dangerous policies adopted thus far by the Trump administration arguably lie in the area of immigration. Nothing says fascism more than dispatching federalized National Guard troops to the border, as Trump did in 2018, or incarcerating undocumented immigrant children in makeshift detention camps, or withholding federal funds from so-called sanctuary states and cities. Trump's policies may be especially oppressive, but they haven't sprung from thin air. In the larger historical context, they fall well within the boundaries of America's deep-seated nativist traditions. From the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the, quote, Red Scares, unquote, of the 20th century, the, quote, Operation Wetback, unquote, mass roundups of the Eisenhower administration, the expedited deportation hearings instituted by Bill Clinton, and the deportation record set by Barack Obama. Our immigration laws and policies have been driven by political expediency, paranoia, scapegoating, racism, and economic exploitation. Trump has simply taken advantage of them to consolidate and appease his electoral base. 6. The transformation of the Department of Homeland Security into a mobile paramilitary force. Since its creation in 2002, the Department of Homeland Security has grown to become the third largest federal agency with more than 240,000 employees. More than 60,000 DHS employees work as law enforcement officers assigned to the Border Patrol, the Federal Protective Service, and other units. DHS operates at the direction of the president. In July, DHS forces were dispatched to Portland, where they bombarded protesters with tear gas and pepper spray, savagely beat protesters, and abducted some in unmarked rented vans. Rather than reprimand the agency for its excesses, Trump has promised to use similar tactics in other cities. He's also threatened to invoke the 1807 Insurrection Act to send the U.S. military to quell protests elsewhere. There are a whole lot of laws here that he's covering that as soon as we get him out of office, the next administration ought to be looking to repeal, because these laws represent the dangerous architecture of fascism that exists in our current federal government. Number 7, abuse of the pardon power. The Constitution gives the president broad authority to grant reprieves and pardons for federal crimes. Presidents since George Washington have exercised the power, sometimes controversially. No president has used the power to reward political cronies, misfits, and crooks more than Trump. In 2017, Trump pardoned Joe Arpaio, the notorious Arizona sheriff, after he had been convicted in federal court of criminal contempt. In 2018, he pardoned the far-right pundit Dinesh D'Souza, who had pleaded guilty in 2014 to making an illegal campaign contribution. In 2019, he pardoned 3 military officers accused of committing war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. And earlier this year, he commuted the prison sentence of his longtime advisor and associate, Roger Stone. In the manner of a dedicated fascist, Trump has even claimed the absolute right to pardon himself if the need ever arose. 8. Eroding Justice Department independence. No fascist takeover can be complete without the steadfast loyalty of government prosecutors to the nation's supreme leader. Till the arrival of Trump, every president since Nixon had respected the operational independence of the Department of Justice. The DOJ's independence, however, is not enshrined in the Constitution or protected by federal statutory law. It is a norm that the president, as head of the executive branch, can breach at will. Trump has worked hard to break the DOJ. When he fired Jeff Sessions, his first attorney general, in November 2018, he replaced him with Bill Barr, a hardline proponent of the unitary executive, quote unquote, a theory of governance that espouses a wide-ranging expansion of presidential power. Since then, as Intercept columnist James Risen has charged, Barr has turned the Justice Department into a law firm with one client, Donald Trump. 9, voter suppression. In the run-up to the 2020 election, Trump's new appointee as Postmaster General, a former donor named Louis DeJoy, is shutting down local post offices and reducing overtime pay for postal workers under the guise of cost-cutting to sabotage the agency that will be charged with by delivering a critical mass of mail-in ballots in the fall, combined with other suppression techniques that are already in place, strict voter ID laws, voting roll purges, the closing of polling stations, etc. A grand plan is taking shape to cast doubt on the vote tallies in crucial swing states. As the plan unfolds and the election's legitimacy is called into question, Trump and his allies can be expected to summon the Supreme Court to ride to their rescue in a replay of Bush versus Gore, the infamous judicial coup d'etat that handed the 2000 presidential election to the GOP. Alternatively, Trump could try to push the election to the House of Representatives, where the outcome would be determined according to the arcane procedures of the 12th Amendment, which, by the way, weights each state equally, regardless of population, in certain key ways, so that even though the House of Representatives is held by the Democrats, it could very well be the case that they could swing the election to Trump because of the unequal weight that the Republican House members might have because of the state by state weighting specified in the 12th Amendment. Whether Trump can pull off such a scheme remains to be seen. One thing, however, is certain. If Trump wins another term, the fascism we're seeing in America today will pale in comparison to the fascism we'll see tomorrow. Absolutely. And that is one big reason why Trump has to be gotten out right now. And so, let us then go on to the next item, which is the battle for the post office. This article appeared in Common Dreams. April 19, 2020, House Democrats unveil a bill to restore mail service to, quote, pre-de jour levels, unquote, and require the USPS to treat all ballots as first class. And so there's a bill afoot. So DeJoy vowed to suspend changes to Postal Service operations until after the election, but House Democrats on Wednesday unveiled a new piece of legislation that would go further by requiring the complete restoration of mail service to, quote, by pre-de jour levels, unquote, while also providing the agency with $25 billion in additional emergency funding. The bill, an updated version of Representative Carolyn Maloney's Delivering for America Act, would also require that all ballots and other election-related mail be treated as first class to ensure a timely delivery of the mail. So without going through the whole article, since we're running short of time, the bill was unveiled a day after DeJoy announced, in the face of immense public backlash, that he is suspending changes to USPS policies until after the election to avoid even the appearance of any impact on election mail. And so union leaders, civil rights groups, and lawmakers have immediately denounced his walk back as inadequate, noting that he did not commit to completely undoing changes such as the removal of mail sorting machines that have contributed to major mail backlogs across the nation. It should not have taken the Postmaster General this long to recognize that his actions were causing major delays in rural and urban communities and among veterans, seniors, and families across the country, said Carolyn Maloney, who currently is the chairman of the House Oversight Committee. Quote again, his announcement is certainly necessary, but it is inadequate to remedy the damage already done and ensure ballots will be delivered on time this November. She said every single member of the House should vote in favor of our legislation this coming Saturday. Our bill will do two things. So she's calling on Republicans to vote for this bill. It will restore previous delivery standards and operations throughout the coronavirus crisis, and it will give the Postal Service the funding it needs to ensure that mail medicines and mail-in ballots are delivered in a timely way. So that is that article. But what will force the House? What will force the House to reinstitute such a safeguard against impending fascism? Sorry, folks. I inadvertently closed my StreamYard, but you should be still seeing me again. There was, okay, an interruption, a brief interruption, but you should still be seeing me again. So stay around, and I'm going to be back. So, as I was saying, what can force the Republicans, what might force the Republicans in the House to vote for the new bill by Maloney that's coming in to protect the post office and protect, okay, the election mail. And there was another article in Common Dreams this morning by Jessica Corbett, which the headline is, ahead of the key House vote, polling shows bipartisan majority of Americans want more funding for the USPS. A new pair of polls showed that a bipartisan majority of Americans are concerned about the U.S. Postal Service and want more money directed to the agency. Results released just days before the Democrat held on the U.S. House is set to vote on legislation to provide the USPS with $25 billion in emergency funding and restore mail operations disrupted by Postmaster General DeJoy's recent controversial policy changes. Reuters Ipsos polling results published Wednesday showed that 78% of Americans surveyed, including 92% of Democrats and 67% of the Republicans, agree a well-functioning United States Postal Service is important to having a smooth and successful election during the coronavirus pandemic. The poll conducted from August 14th to 18th also found that almost three-quarters of respondents, including 88% of Democrats and 60% of the Republicans, agree funding for the United States Postal Service should be increased to ensure Americans' mail gets delivered in a timely manner. And the League of Women Voters, has tweeted, about that. They, of course, are in support of it. The Reuters Ipsos survey came a day after the release of data for progress polling that found, quote, by substantial margins, nearly all segments of voters prefer the USPS be funded as an essential service like the military rather than requiring it to cover its own costs like a business, unquote. So that's different. People haven't raised that issue for some time. Of course, it's better that it's funded as an essential service like the military. It never should have been turned into a business by these neoliberal idiots. Over 58% of people polled by Data for Progress, a progressive think tank, expressed support for treating the USPS as an essential service. There were majorities of both Democratic voters and independent or third-party voters. 75% of Democrats and 52% of independent or third-party voters agreed with this approach, compared with only 43% of Republican voters. That may change as the Republican voters fail to get their medications and their paychecks on time. They may begin to see the wisdom of making the post office an essential service that cannot be tanked in various ways by the Republicans. Data for Progress also asked voters whether they have sent mail via the Postal Service in the past 2 weeks. Think mail service has gotten worse in the past month, are concerned about Trump appointing a top donor to run the agency, are worried about reported slowdowns in USPS services, and support $25 billion in emergency funding for the agency to update and digitize its infrastructure as part of a coronavirus relief bill. And the results were, do I have the results for all of it? A majority of voters across the political spectrum are somewhat or very concerned about Trump's appointment of DeJoy just months before the November election that will heavily rely on mail-in voting because of the ongoing pandemic, while 86% of Democrats expressed some deep concern. The sentiment was shared by only 39% of Republicans. Similarly, 60% of all voters are somewhat or very concerned about reported slowdowns of mail service. There was also a partisan divide on this question, with 78% of Democrats worried about service delays compared with 46% of Republicans. In terms of $25 billion in funding, 63% of all voters said they somewhat or strongly support it, including 79% of Democrats and 52% of the Republicans. Quick recap. Everyone loves the USPS, the American Postal Workers Union tweeted Tuesday in response to Data for Progress polling results. And then there's tweeting of the results of the Data for Progress survey. I think those majorities we're seeing in surveys like that are going to get bigger the longer the delays are and the closer the election gets. I think that's going to happen, and that's going to build up pressure both in the House and the Senate to pass this bill. I think, it's a good bill, and it's going to find a lot, of bipartisan support. In the midst of, so Nancy Pelosi said, earlier today I spoke with Postmaster General DeJoy regarding his alleged pause in operational changes. During our conversation, he admitted he has no intention of replacing the sorting machines, the mailboxes, and other infrastructure that have been removed, unquote. In the midst of widespread outrage and alarm that the changes could disenfranchise voters and allegations that the Postmaster General and the President are attempting to sabotage the election, Nancy Pelosi announced on Sunday she was calling House members back from recess to Washington, D.C. early to vote this coming Saturday on related legislation. The HEROES Act that House Democrats passed in May would have allocated $25 billion to the USPS, a figure that Nancy Pelosi has said is recommended by the Services Board of Governors. However, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has refused to allow a vote on that piece of legislation. The bill the House plans to vote on Saturday was unveiled on Wednesday. There's an updated version of Representative Carolyn Maloney's Delivering for America Act. In addition to the funding and requirements to restore mail service to pre-DeJoy levels, the measure would also mandate that all ballots and other election-related mail be treated as first class. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And, I took that already. So that's me for tonight. I am now going to move to your comments and see what you had to say. Looks like a fair amount of comments. Oh, but there are none before 10:12 p.m. I know a lot of you are here before 10:12. I don't know why I can't see those, but I cannot see them on my StreamYard. I don't know if they're there on Facebook, but I'll go through the StreamYard comments that I can see first. So starting with the one, okay, by Evelina at 10:12. Steve Wolfbrandt, they're not exactly campaigning anywhere right now, though. And Lana says, asterisk, feel about ranked choice. I guess that's probably a correction to a previous comment. In cases, I kind of like that, Lana, from what I have heard of it. Evelina says, are they, Steve? And Steve DeVore says, it was to protect slavery. Now they're saying it's to protect the smaller states. What I know is if we removed it, Republicans would never win again, especially with the path they've taken. They'd have to change their party a lot, quickly, make it much more democratic, very quickly. Kay says, I'm with you, Stephen. And Steve Wolfbrand says, Evelina and Kay, the COVID has curtailed campaigning. It's a very weird year. Carmen says, he will say Russiagate spying ordered by Democrats gives him another 4 years. Did DT really forgive Susan B. Anthony? What a vacuous gesture, if so. Yes, apparently he pardoned Susan B. Anthony. I don't know if it's doing her any good. I'm sure she went to heaven anyway. But that's not where Trump's going. Steve DeVore says, at that point, I would hope all those Second Amendment people put an end to that immediately. Evelina says, Steve Wolfbrandt, we know, it's a weird year. Might get weirder. Steve Wolfbrandt said he pardoned her. She was arrested for voting like 150 years ago. Carbon Muniz says, stupid man. Kay says, no doubt about that, Evelina. I think this will last a very long time, Steve Wolfbrandt said. Which one, Trump or Biden? Laugh out loud. Carmen says, it's clear he's a fascist, but what is anyone going to do about it? Well, that's what I wanted to talk to you about in part. I gave you a link. I didn't actually display the link or share it here, though I can probably at this point just share on the front of it. Okay, I don't want to play it because what happened? Should have come up. Oh, here it is. Okay, there was this morning, okay, there was an episode, okay, of Rumble. It's episode number 110. The moment of truth, okay, is here. And it's directly relevant to Carmen Muniz's comment. It's gotten 6201 views so far. It premiered 23 hours ago. It's much too long to play here. I highly recommend it. I listened to it this morning. It was excellent. It was about Michael Moore's plan to resist what he sees as a planned takeover of the government by Donald Trump based on claims of election fraud or rigging, okay, or what have you. But what Michael talks about is the various things he thinks that Trump will do from now until election time and past election time to try to keep control of the government. And he also talks about what we need to do, what we, the public, will need to do in order to stop Trump. the kind of movement we will have to generate and the kinds of actions this movement will have to take. Okay, now, I believe that Michael's advice, both to us and to Biden and Harris, is very, very well taken. Let me just share the front of this for you. Share screen. Let me just share the front of this for you so you can see what the front of the video looks like. It's a Rumble podcast. Okay. Episode number 110, The Moment of Truth, is here. And he talks about what he thinks Biden and Harris should do. And to summarize that, he thinks that they should begin to lead right now. They should begin to lead. Just go around Trump and start organizing people to basically take control, to plan the initiatives that they will be able to use to block Trump and to take control of the government. Michael has a lot of good proposals and suggestions, including getting the House to call officials of the government and to make them under oath affirm that in case of any actions by Trump to take over the government, that they will fulfill their oaths of office and defend the Constitution against Trump. But he also has a lot of suggestions, not just for our leaders, but for us in terms of the organization of a mass movement that is powerful enough to stop any possible takeover by Trump that will call millions of people into Washington, D.C. to surround the White House. And also, Michael Moore is not the only one talking about this. On the Nomi Key Kuntz show today, on one of her shows anyway, she had an interview with Sarah Nelson, who's the head of the airline union. And so Sarah has been talking general strike now, thinking about general strike for some time. And she's talking to a well-known organizer at Jane McAlevey to join with her to organize an effort for Election Day and beyond. But maybe she'll take heart from what Michael Moore had to say, and she, and McAlevey will join, with Michael Moore to begin to organize the resistance in full force right now, not wait, until Election Day, not wait to see until Trump actually abides by the result of the election, but that right now the resistance starts. That, is pretty important. Anyway, I gave you that link in the Facebook description, so you will be able to link to the podcast and to hear it. So that's important. I forgot to cover it in my discussion. So thank you for reminding me. And Carmen says, it's clear he's a fascist, but what is anyone going to do about it? Well, there are a lot of things we can do about it. And the first thing that you can do is you can listen to the podcast, today. You can listen to the podcast and you can take heart from it. But we have to take it seriously. We have to get ourselves organized. There should be a unification with Corona Strike and what it's been trying to put together. I had an interview, with Arakel Bloss, a few months ago about that. She should be involved in this too. And Sarah Nelson, and McAlevey should come together as well. We need one big movement with lots of organizers and lots of supporters getting together to generate many millions of people coming to D.C. to ensure that both the election and the post-election period go forward without a hitch. Okay, Michael Moore talks about getting 50 million people and more to pledge that they will join such an activist movement, to actually sign pledges and take oaths right now to defend the Constitution. Okay, says apparently nothing should have been done a long time ago, and that's my message to you too. Okay, listen to the podcast; it's excellent. Steve says, "What do you suggest?" Steve Wolfbrand says, "Ahmed knows. All this fascism is driving me to drinking." Just kidding, Carmen says. Steve Wolfbrandt asks him, "Stop driving that hot rod Lincoln," says Steve. Hot rod Lincoln? Since when have there been hot rod Lincolns? Carmen says, "Damn, getting a migraine." And Steve says, Evelina Pont, the alter ego. No, the alter ego is Avril. And Carmen says, DT's and Melania's mail-in ballots were returned to them in Florida, and the grimy bastard wants to rig it for everyone else. I forgot what the reason was. His only reason is, it won't be good for me. That's always his only real reason. He gives out a bunch of BS about what his reason is, but the only real reason is, I don't want those ballots coming in if they're not going to be good for me. That's it. Sandy says Obama's giving his 2 cents. Carmen says, uh-oh, lost video. And Sandy says, welcome back, Joe. Well, I'm glad to see that Carmen said, uh-oh, lost video. And Sandy is welcoming me back, both at 10:27 p.m. It means I got on top of it quickly and brought it back. And Lana says hello, and Kay says you're back. And Carmen says, woo, you're back from outer space. Yeah. Steve says, I'm predicting that this election will be so muddied that there will be no clear-cut winner. Then things get dicey. Carmen says, that's precisely the goal. That's what we're all afraid of. Steve says this could well end in a military coup. I rolled it back or forward too far. I got to get back to, here it is. It could well end in a military coup. Hopefully benevolent, but you never know. Sandy says, I would love to see the military physically remove Trump from office. I would love to see that too, but that doesn't have to be a military coup. If they moved him physically from office after the president-elect actually takes office and orders them to do so, that would be completely in order according to law. Well, actually, it should be the Department of Homeland Security that does it, as opposed to the military, because the military is not supposed to be used for domestic stuff. Carmen says, love all the topics tonight. Thank you, Carmen. Because your stream interrupted, so your comment stream got snapped. No, the comment stream got snapped before that. My stream got interrupted at, what was it, something like 10:27 or something like that. But my comment stream was interrupted. I don't have anything before 10:12. So that's not the explanation. Steve DeVore said, I asked this earlier, but I don't know if you can see it. What's the difference between fiscal policy, and monetary policy? In a nutshell, what monetary policy does is, it largely works by adjusting interest rates and by buying and selling securities. In other words, it might trade had new reserves, basically cash, for securities, either federal securities or corporate securities, which it buys, okay, for the cash. Okay. It also will set interest rates like the federal fund rate. Also, monetary policy is carried out by the Federal Reserve. Fiscal policy is carried out by the Treasury. And fiscal policy usually means taxation or federal spending, including, of course, the deficit spending, including issuing the Treasury securities in order to back up, okay, the deficit spending, since people believe that issuing Treasury securities, okay, is necessary. But really, I don't know exactly what they believe. It's just been habit. It's a hangover from gold standard days. The Rumble online podcast, yes. Steve says, I refuse to vote for Biden. That's all right. That's all right, Steve. Refuse to vote for Biden. Okay, a lot of people are not going to vote for Biden. I am unlikely at this point to vote for Biden. Carmen says, oh, yes, that's the ticket. Michael Moore, I caught a lot of flack not too long ago. He's always catching flack. I saw that Nomiki Kant show too, Joe. Yeah, wasn't that a good show? Sarah Nelson was terrific, wasn't she? Carmen says, oh, good, maybe we can get airplane to fly into Mar-a-Lago where DT is golfing. Thanks, okay, I will check it out. I wonder what happens, okay, if you get an airplane and you try to fly over Mar-a-Lago. I wonder whether the Air Force jets start scrambling in that case. Carmen says, thanks, I will check it out. Steve says, Americans aren't into general strikes. The third of us aren't working right now anyway, ain't going to happen. Steve, there's always a first time for stuff. Okay? And Americans might be well into general strikes anyway if it's over the election. Carmen says strikes are hard because of COVID. No, strikes are easy because of COVID, because you could stay home. They're easier because of COVID. You don't necessarily have to get out into the streets. Only a certain number have to get out into the streets. Surrounding the White House, people have to get out into the streets. They'll have to get out into the streets. They'll have to social distance. They'll have to be masked. Dr. Joe, do you think Corp Dems will take... Yeah, I think they'll take more up on it. And I think also progressives will. I think a lot of people might. Because there are a lot, okay, of corporate Dems. They like the previous inverted totalitarian government that can pretend, okay, to be a democracy. They're not too hot on a naked fascist government in the United States. I don't think that sits well with them. Kay says people are in the streets in Belarus right now over their own fascist election. Good for them. Evelina says, we'll try. Some people think outsiders are stirring trouble there, okay, in Belarus. And Carms says, thanks, I stand corrected. By the way, people always say when there are protests that it's outside agitators, don't they? That was, it still is, a favorite tactic down south. Whenever they get any protests down south, it's about outside agitators, right? Okay. It's not about our blacks, it's about outside agitators. Thanks, I stand corrected. And Evelina says, you are. Carmen says, need to jot down when I'm watching to help me absorb and remember all the good info. Headaches rob me of so much. Kay says, I've been following the Richard, can't remember his last name right now, who gave several live reports from there on MSNBC earlier today. Looked legit to him. He's one of the few actual reporters we have left. I'm not sure who you mean, Kay. Kay's about to tell us. Richard Engel. Yeah, Richard Engel. Yeah, usually he's in Iraq. Or anyway, he gained fame from his coverage, okay, in Iraq. He goes where the danger is. That's what he does. I mean, I think the guy is addicted to adrenaline. The risks he takes are really amazing. Evelina Pont says, yes, I agree with COVID. Strikes are easy. Kay says, I heard about a possible general strike for September 1st. Yeah, people are talking about that too. And Steve says, how do you tell a striker from a quarantiner? Well, a striker is someone who's supposed to be at work, right? And a striker is someone, well, also, both strikers and quarantiners won't go to stores. In other words, what's effective about a general strike also is that you shut down businesses. Kay says, I love Richard Engel. Yeah, I think it's Engel if I remember correctly. I might be wrong about that, though. I am not absolutely certain about that. I'm going to go to Facebook, see if I can catch any comments that appeared before 10. Let me see if I can see comments here. Get this. Okay, I can see this better now. Let me go back to the beginning and see if I can get. Nope. I don't have the earlier comments on my Facebook page either, I don't think. Let me see if I can get the comments here. Facebook is not cooperating with me tonight. Did Dr. Campbell happen to mention if there's a worse COVID mutation coming? I haven't seen anything like that from him as yet, Carmen. He seems to think the chances of a worse one are small. He seems to think the news is good with respect to the likelihood of getting a vaccine. He seems to think that for those who have had COVID, the immunity they now have is probably long-term immunity. There were 3 recent research papers that dealt with these questions, and they all agree that these things are likely. So that is good. That is very good news. Very, very good news. Okay, according to my Facebook, I have only 29 shares tonight. That is not good. Please do what you can and share as much as you can now. In the remaining, oh no, I have 147 shares. I take that back. Maybe I've recovered my comments too. Let me see. I probably got a sound echo by now also. Nope. Still going through my microphone, so that should be good. Okay, let me see if I can get into these earlier comments yet. Nope. I still have only the late ones. Okay, thank you for all the shares. There are 147 shares. That's pretty good, considering what we were competing with tonight. Why does everybody still love Obama? Why can't they see what a terrible job he did for us? He really did a terrible job. By the way, even though he didn't directly cause Trump, because Trump wasn't running against him in any direct sense, okay, but Hillary, it is still the case, it is still the case that he set the stage. If he had had a successful presidency from the socioeconomic standpoint, uh, then Trump would probably never have been nominated. He probably never would have even have gotten in. There was anger, there was frustration that put him in. And it was frustration against the establishment. And it was a very close victory. It was a very close victory on his part. He almost didn't make it. So Carmen says, yeah, Obama has finesse. Steve says incarnation. And Evelina says, you don't have to strike, Steve. And Steve says, viruses generally mutate to less lethal incarnations, but not always. And Carmen says, yes, good news, thanks. I'm limited in Wi-Fi availability. Okay, I'm afraid I can't help much with respect to the early comments. Let me try one more thing. Let me try one more thing. It won't affect the StreamYard, I don't believe. I think I'm still here with StreamYard. Sandy Degg has posted a comment with the satanic horns and a pitchfork painted on Hillary Clinton's face. But that was actually, okay, in connection with another share, okay, of my video. Steve Wolfbrand says, Evelina, I can afford to strike, but my fellow Americans may not be. And then it says, I don't have much time for either of the Obamas, and I voted for him twice. So I was able to pick up some other comments, but not the earlier comments. The earlier comments don't seem to be there. So I don't know what that's about. Anyway, for now, I will go back to StreamYard and see if anything has shown up there. And Dolores says, same. Kay says, I'm with you, Lana Dell. Steve says, me too. I bought the Hope and Change crap. Yeah, I bought the Hope and Change crap, especially in 2008. I didn't buy it in 2012. But frankly, in 2012, I did the lesser of two evils thing. I shouldn't have done that. I should have voted green in 2012. I certainly should have done that. That was a mistake. In 2008, I got fooled, and so that was a mistake too. But lots of people got fooled. So Carmen says, Satan doesn't want HRC. Sandy saying, she wants his job too. Carmen says, hell yeah. Catherine Tokarska says, that's what I did. Okay, folks, I've reached the end of the comments. So I'm going to say goodnight. I posted another video today. I posted the video on Pavlina's thread. After we get off, I'm going to post another short take. This one is on, hang on a second. get it. Okay, I posted a take called Pavlina Chernyeva on the private and public sectors earlier today. But later tonight, I'm going to post a short take called Missing in Action on the First Night, which is about what we did not see on the first night. And tomorrow I'll be posting one called Authoritarianism and COVID-19 Failures. Okay, that will be, another short take on that, during the day. Then, tomorrow night, I'd like to have another Q&A session on everything I've done this week, all the live streams this week up to that point. Actually, from last Saturday going forward, and also on the progressive short takes, that I've done. So I want to have a Q&A session on that tomorrow night. Okay? So, I shall see you then. I hope I'll have some good topics tomorrow night. People are saying good night. Thank you for the good nights. Are we for or against ranked choice voting? I am for ranked choice voting, very much for ranked choice voting, because then people don't get into this bind of, if I vote for the one I really prefer, I'm going to waste my vote. No, if you vote for the one, you prefer, and then for the lesser of two evils for the second vote, it doesn't waste your vote. Okay. So, and ranked choice voting then may encourage people to vote for their first choice first, which would give third parties a much better chance. So I am for ranked choice voting. Steve says good night, and Dolores Pierce says thank you and good night all. Thank you, Dolores, and good night to you. Lana says good night. Kay says thank you for another great discussion. I love you all. I love you all too. I second that motion. Steve says he missed it. And Dolores says love you too. And Carmen says thanks for an excellent night. Every topic was spot on. Dolores says sounds great. And Sandy says thank you, Joe. Good night, friends. Thank you, Sandy. Carmen says my emojis are hyper. It must be Abdul. Steve says good night, and ranked choice is the way we should vote. Steve Volkman says, of course, ranked choice voting would be wonderful. So we all seem to be agreed that ranked choice voting would be wonderful, certainly better than what we have now. So, and if we could get ranked choice voting and have a multi-party system, I think things would probably be even better. Even better. So, anyway, good night, and let's look forward to that Q&A tomorrow. I certainly think it should be a great one, and I'll be also trying to catch up on some of the convention doings that are worth catching up on. I don't know if there are any worth catching up on, but I'll try and catch up some, and we can have some Q&As about that too tomorrow. And Steve says Abdul is from a parallel universe. So you believe in parallel universes, huh, Steve? Ever read a book called The Fabric of Reality? Anyway, look it up. It's a cool book about the parallel universe interpretation of quantum theory. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. Carmen says, night, Bonnie. Night, John Boy. Good night, everybody. Hey, Bonnie, Carmen said good night to you.
I heard that.
Sandy said good night to Mary Ellen. I guess that's also from Little House on the Prairie. And Carmen says, Steve believes in everything. Well, parallel universes make a lot of sense, actually. That interpretation of quantum theory makes a lot of sense.